Welcome back, everyone. We'll continue with the discussion that we let off in the last session, where we began to figure out how does the market allocation affect welfare, right? In the last session, we talked about consumer surplus. How do we measure the welfare of consumers at different prices? And what we found was that there's a handy little measure of measuring how much welfare consumers enjoy inside inside of a market economy or at different price levels in a certain sense, right? So the discussion came down to when we think about consumer surplus, we think about it as the difference between the willingness to pay of the consumer and the price that they are asked to pay. The bigger that difference is, the larger the consumer surplus for that individual consumer, and then we aggregate across all of these consumer surpluses to get to the overall level of consumer surplus inside the economy, right? At a given price, right? Now we'll turn our attention to the other side of the economy as usual. If you go back to our initial framing of how we study economics in general, we think of a kind of a delineation between consumers uh, side of the economy and the producer side of the economy, right? So now we'll turn our attention to figure out how much welfare do producers enjoy at different price levels, right? That's the notion of a producer surplus, is that we think about how much excess uh, surplus do producers get at different price levels. Producer surplus is also a simple way of just, or a slightly more technical way of saying profit, right? So if you think about producer surplus, the first crucial thing that we need to understand about producer surplus is the cost, right? So when we think about cost, it's the value of everything that a seller, so a person who's producing this good, must give up in order to produce a good. It's the value of all the inputs that goes in. It's the value of everything, all the other investment opportunities which the producer foregoes to produce this particular good or service. This is going to give us an indication of the seller's ability to supply this good into the market at different price levels. Right? So, for instance, if you think about a market which consists of only three producers, right? So they're in the lawn cutting business, and there's only three producers. They have different cost functions, right? So for Jack, it costs him $10. So you can think of $10 as the cost of, traveling to that location, to set up the equipment, to buy the equipment, the amortized cost of the equipment, and all of that. So it costs Jack about $10 in order to mow your lawn, right? This cost should also take into account the opportunity cost for Jack in a certain sense. So if Jack is going to be mowing lawns for an hour, he's not going to be able to do whatever his next best option was for that hour, right? Because scarcity is the a source of uh, prices in a certain sense in a market economy. And for Jack, the cost here not only takes into account his explicit cost of mowing a lawn for an hour, it also takes into account his implicit cost, his opportunity cost of all the other opportunities that he could have exploited for that 1 hour, but he didn't. Okay. So for Jack, the cost is $10. For Janet is 20, and for Chrissy is 35. Right? They have different cost structures. They're all in the same business, but they come into this business with different cost structures. Right? So from the cost structure, we can basically derive the entirety of the supply curve. Right? And we do the same exercise that we did when we talked about consumers, where we use their willingness to pay in order to derive the demand curve. Similarly, on the producer side, we use the cost in order to derive the supply curve, right? So when the price that the market is willing to support is between $0 to $9, the quantity supplied would be zero, right? Because it's below cost for all three suppliers in this market, all three producers in this market. No one wants to be in this business of mowing a lawn. If the price that is getting paid is between $0 and $9, the supply in the market is going to be zero, right? So when the price is between $10 and $19, Jack looks at this and says, okay, my cost is $10. I'm getting paid more than $10 in order to mow the lawn. Okay. And I would jump at the opportunity. Jack would jump in and say, I'll take the job. But Janet and Chrissy have costs which are higher than whatever the market price is, with the price the market is willing to support. It's between $10 and $19. So Janet and Chrissy stay out of the market. So the total quantity supplied of lawn mowers is one. Okay. Similarly, when the price goes to between $20 and $34, Janet jumps in because Janet's cost is only $20. So she jumps in, and now the quantity supplied is two because now both Jack and Janet are going to supply into this market. And finally, if the price goes up at $35 and more, Chrissy also jumps into the market and the quantity supplied goes to three. Right? All three of them are in the market when price is above $35. Right? So we can use this to basically draw the supply curve. So we have the supply schedule. So remember, the supply schedule tells us at different price levels what is the quantity supply, right? So when the price is between $0 and $9, you're going to have zero supply, right? So between $0 and $9, you're not going to have any supply in this market. So when the price hits $10 or more, at $10, when it just goes slightly above $10, the quantity supplied is 1 unit. So we see this increase in quantity supplied by 1 unit, and it stays at that 1 unit supply till the price reaches $20. When the price switches over to slightly above $20, the second lawnmower Janet jumps in, and so the quantity supplied in this market goes to 2, and it will stay at that level till the price hits $34, slightly above $35, in which case Chrissy also jumps in and the quantity supplied shifts to 3, and then it just stays at 3 forever because there's only 3 lawnmowers. Okay, so that's what we are seeing, right? Between these price ranges, when the price is between $10 and $19, the overall quantity supplied is only 1 unit, and as the price changes, more and more suppliers begin to jump into the market, and the quantity supplied starts to go up. Okay, so we can use the cost structure of different supplies in the market to derive the entirety of the supply curve. So if you know the cost structures for all the different supplies in the market, you're able to come up with the supply curve, right? When we started off this analysis, we just started with the abstraction that, yeah, all markets have a demand curve and a supply curve. Now we lower the level of abstraction and see where it's coming from. The demand curve is basically derived from understanding consumers' willingness to pay, and then the quantity demanded at each of those price levels, and that gives us the demand curve. And for the supply curve, we look at the seller's cost structure, and that tells us how the supply curve is derived. Okay, all right. At each quantity, right, at each particular quantity, the price is going to tell us, right, the height of this curve here is going to tell us the cost of the marginal uh, and the cost for the marginal seller, right? When the price is at $10 or slightly above $10, because the cost is exactly 10. So if the price is exactly 10, the seller is indifferent. So they could be in the market or not because they just break even. They don't make any profit. So if the price is slightly above 10, that's where the first lawnmower jumps into the market to supply this service, right? So that makes this particular price the price for the marginal seller, right? This is the marginal seller. It's a seller who would leave the market if the price dropped any lower. If the price dipped even slightly below $10, this marginal seller would leave this market. So at different price levels, at different quantities, I should say, the height of the supply curve tells us the cost for the marginal seller at that quantity. Right? So here when the quantity supply toggles from 0 to 1, the height of the supply curve tells me Jack's cost. When the quantity supplied again changes from 1 to 2, the height of the supply curve tells me what Janet's cost is, about $20. And when the quantity supply toggles from 2 to 3 here, right, here the quantity supplied is still 2, and this is where it toggles over to 3. Right, so this is where it toggles over to 3, at which point the height here is going to tell me Chrissy's cost. Okay, so that's the second thing to recognize, is that the height of the supply curve at any quantity is going to tell me the cost for the marginal seller. Okay, so when we think about producer surplus, it's straightforward. Producer surplus is going to be, for any producer, is going to be the difference between the price that they receive for the good or service versus what it costs for them to produce this good or service. The difference is what we call the surplus. This is the surplus to the producer. This is also in a technical way of just saying profit, right? If I receive price P for my good and it costs me whatever it is, so if I get $20 to perform the service and the cost for me is $10, the difference between those two, the $10, the 10 additional dollars that I earn above my cost, is what we call the producer surplus, right? So this is basically the price received versus the willingness to sell. So if you think about the cost is also indicating the willingness to sell, the price at which you're willing to sell this particular good or service. Okay. So if you think about what the producer surplus looks like on the supply curve, the producer surplus, remember, is the difference between the price paid minus the cost. Okay. So suppose the price is $25. Suppose the price in the market is $25. So if the price here is $25, there's going to be two suppliers in the market. So the total amount of supply in this market is going to be 2 units, and it's going to be supplied by Jack and Janet, right? The 2 units of lawn mowing service are provided by Jack and Janet. If I look at Jack's producer surplus, the price that he receives is $25. His cost is only $10. So the difference here is about $15, right? The difference between the price minus the cost. Uh, for the price here is 25. The cost to Jack is 10. So the producer surplus for Jack is $15. For Janet, on the other hand, Janet has a higher cost structure. Janet's cost is $20. The price that she's getting paid for the service is 25. So for Janet, the producer surplus is $5. The difference between the price that she's receiving minus the cost that she incurs to produce the service, that difference is what we call the producer surplus. Okay. And Chrissy's producer surplus is basically zero. Why is Chrissy's producer surplus zero? Because he doesn't provide the service in this market, because his cost exceeds the price that the market is willing to support. The price here is $25, and Chrissy's cost is $30. He stays $35, and he stays out of the market altogether. So the producer surplus for Chrissy is zero. So the total producer surplus in this market is going to be the area below the price and above the supply curve going from zero to the quantity supplied, right? That's the story here, right? So if I find this total area here, so to find this area, what can I do? I can basically look at it as two rectangles as a sum of these two areas. The area of this rectangle here is length times length here is breadth is 1. The length here is 25 minus 10, which is 15. So the area of this rectangle here is 15, okay, which is what is represented by Jack's producer surplus, plus the area of this rectangle where the breadth here is again 1, the height here is 25 minus 20, which is 5. So the area of this rectangle is 5. So the total area here is 15 plus 5, or 20, right? The total producer surplus is $20, right? Between the two producers who are willing to supply into the market at this particular price, the total amount of profit between the both of them, or total amount of producer surplus between the both of them, is $20. In general, the way we calculate producer surplus is to look at the area below the price but above the supply curve, going from zero to the quantity supply. Okay? That's how we define total producer surplus. Right? So if we have a lot of sellers, right? So if we consider market with lots of sellers, as we said, this basically smooths out, right? So here what we look at as a stepwise function basically smooths out into a flat curve and an upward sloping supply curve here. Okay. So the supply curve here is upward sloping. It's relating the price to quantity supplied, and as usual, what we have here is a lot of sellers, and we have a smooth supply curve because we have a lot of sellers. Okay. So suppose the price in this market is $40, right? Suppose the price here is $40. We want to find the total producer surplus in this situation. Again, remember, the total producer surplus is going to be the area below the price but above the supply curve, going from 0 to the quantity supplied at that particular price. So the quantity supplied here is going to be 25. Okay, so we want to know what the area of this triangle here is, right? So, okay, uh, okay. Let me just show you what happens. So if I have to find the area of this triangle here, what is the area of this triangle is half times base times height. So the height here would be, this is 15, right? This is 15, this is 40, so the height here would be 25. Okay, and the length, the base of this triangle is about 25, right? So the area of this triangle would be half times 25 times 25. 25 times 25 is 225, over 2 is about 112.5, right? So the total producer surplus here, I'll show you in a second, is about 112.5. Okay, so the height of this triangle here is 25 bucks, and the base of this triangle is 25. So the producer surplus is the area of this triangle, which is half times the base times the height. The base here is 25, the height here is also 25. So 1 half times base times height, 1 half times 25 times 25 is 525 over 2, or 212.5, right? So I think I said 112.5, but yeah, it's 212.5, okay? That's the total producer surplus in this market at this particular price. This is very similar to how we did consumer surplus. With consumer surplus, we looked at the area below the demand curve above the price from 0 to that quantity. And with producer surplus, we look at the area below the price above the supply curve from 0 to that quantity. Right? That's basically what's changed. Okay. So what happens if prices fall in the market? Right? So suppose the price starts off at 40 bucks and the price falls to 30 bucks. So straight away, if I look at the total producer surplus here, it's going to be a smaller triangle than it was before, right? If prices fall, profits fall because the cost is not reacting in any way. So you have the sellers in this market have the same cost structure as they did before, but they're now receiving a lower price for the services that they're providing, right? So if price falls, the total producer surplus is now smaller, obviously, right? So if I think about the total producer surplus in this market now, it would be the area of this triangle. So the area of this triangle is half times the base times the height. The height here is 30 minus 15, which is 15. That's what we get. And the base here is going from 0 to 15. So the base of this triangle is 15 units. So the producer surplus, which is represented by this triangle here, by the area of this triangle here, is half times the base times the height, half times the 15 times 15, which is 225 over 2, or 112.5. Okay. So what's happening, right? So the producer surplus is obviously falling. Earlier, the producer surplus was this entire big triangle here. Now the producer surplus is just the smaller triangle here. Okay. So producer surplus is falling for two reasons. The first reason is once the price falls from 40 to 30 bucks, some sellers whose cost is higher than 30 bucks are going to want to exit the market, right? So you're going to have a few sellers leaving the market when prices fall. Why is that the case? Because they were in the market when the price was 40 bucks only because their cost was over 30 but under 40. So they were still making a small profit, right? So if it costs you if it costs you 31 bucks and you are getting paid 40 bucks, you're still making a profit of 9 bucks per unit, right? So what happens if the price falls to 30? Any seller whose cost is over $30 has no incentive to stay in the market, and so they'll exit the market. So we're going to have a decrease in producer surplus because there is going to be a few sellers who are going to exit the market. The size of that is going to be this triangle here. The size of the loss in producer surplus because of producers exiting the market is going to be the size of this triangle here. Okay, so if I think about the size of this triangle here, what the area here is going to be, so the height here is 10. Okay, the height here is 10. The base here is going to be the difference between these two quantities. Here it was 25, here is 15, so the base here is 10. So the loss in consumer surplus from sellers exiting the market is half times 10 times 10. times 10 is 100 over 2 is 50, right? So I'm going to lose $50 worth of producer surplus from sellers exiting the market because the price is low, right? The second source of the loss or in producer surplus is because the sellers who are still left in the market, whose cost structure is still feasible for them to supply goods into this market when the price is $30, are now getting paid a lower price. So earlier, the cost was the same for this producer. If you think about this producer, his cost was $15. Earlier, he was getting paid $40 for the service, so his producer surplus was 25. But now when the price drops to $30, now the producer surplus is decreased by 50 to 15 because now he's getting paid 30. It costs him 15 to produce this good. So now the producer surplus here is reduced. So this rectangle here represents the loss in producer surplus, the fall in producer surplus for the sellers who stay on in the market but are now getting lower prices, right? So if you think about the size of this rectangle here is length times breadth. So the length here is 10, the breadth here is going to be 15. Okay. So the length here is 10, the breadth here is 15. So 10 times 15 is 150. Okay. All right. So that tells me the two reasons for why producer surplus would fall once prices fall, right? So producer surplus, again, remember, it falls for two reasons. One reason is because when prices fall, a few of the sellers whose cost is above, again, the supply curve is telling me the marginal cost for the seller. There's going to be an exit by sellers whose marginal cost for production is higher than the price that they're receiving. So they all exit the market. All of these sellers exit the market. But at the same time, the remaining sellers who are left in the market, whose cost structure is still viable at the lower prices, all receive uh, lower prices on a per unit basis, and that decreases consumer surplus. Okay. All right. So let's look at an example just to get a feel for this. Suppose we have the supply curve, nice little upward sloping supply curve. Let's answer a few questions. So I have four parts to this question. In the first case, we want to know what the marginal seller's cost is when the quantity is 10 units, right? When the quantity supplied is 10 units, what is the marginal cost to the seller? Okay. Then we want to find the total producer surplus when the price is $20. And then we want to analyze what happens when the price rises to $30, right? We want to disaggregate the increase in the producer surplus. So first of all, when the price goes up from where it was, it's straight away intuitive that producer surplus should go up, right? A higher price is a positive thing for sellers in the market, so producer surplus will obviously go up. But we want to disaggregate the effects of the increase in the producer surplus from new sellers jumping into the market and also the higher price that is received on the existing supply. All right? So let's take each of these in turn. So when the quantity supplied is 10 units, the marginal cost is obviously 20 units. So if I look at this, when the quantity supplied is 10 units, I go up to the supply curve. So the marginal cost for the seller at this point is $20. Okay. So if the price is $20, right? If the price is $20, okay. So So if the price is $20, just ignore this for a second. When the price is $20, the producer surplus is the area of this triangle here, the area below the price, but above the supply curve going from zero to that quantity. Okay. So this is the area of this triangle here. The area of this triangle is half times the base times the height. So half times the base here is going to be this here, which is about 10 units. So half times the base here is 10, the height here is 20. So the height, half times the base times the height, the producer surplus is $100. Okay. So suppose the price goes up to $30. So if the price goes up to 30 bucks, there's going to be an increase in the producer surplus, because now the producer surplus is this larger triangle here, right? And it's going to go up for one of two reasons. One reason is that producer surplus increases because as the price goes up, more sellers begin to enter into this market, right? So if your cost was $21 to produce produce this good, and if the price was 20 bucks, you would stay out of this market. You wouldn't supply anything into this market. But on the other hand, if the price rises above $21, if it's 22 bucks, you would happily jump into this market because it cost you 21 to make it. You can sell it for 22. It's a small profit. You would jump in and supply into this market. And so as the price goes to 30 bucks from 20 bucks, all the sellers who have a cost above 20 but below 30 are now all jumping into the market to sell this good. Okay. So the additional producer surplus produced by the fact that there's more sellers in this market, there's an increase in quantity supplied, is the area of this triangle here, which is again half times base times height. So the base here is going to be 5, 10 minus 15 minus 10 is 5. So base here is 5, and the height of this triangle is 30 minus 20, which is 10. So the area of that triangle is 25 bucks. Okay. So the increase in producer surplus from new sellers entering into the market at higher prices is going to be about 25 bucks. Okay. And the increase in producer surplus for the existing sellers, these were already sellers who were in this market who were willing to sell at 20 bucks because their cost was lower than 20 bucks. Now they make a higher profit. The profit margin has improved, is the area of this triangle, of this rectangle here. The area of this rectangle here is length times breadth. The length here is 10. The breadth here is 10. So 10 times 10 is 100. So 125 in total, right? So the total increase in producer surplus from the increase in prices is about 125 bucks. Okay. So earlier the producer surplus was 100. Now the producer surplus is going to be the area of this bigger triangle. So if you look at the area of this bigger triangle, it's half times base times length height. So the base here is going to be 15. The height here is 300 or 30, and 30 times 15 is 300 or 450 divided by 2 is about 225, and that's what we find, right? So so the producer surplus when the price is 30 bucks is a total of 225, and that's an increase of 125 over when the price was 20 bucks. And the increase in producer surplus is owed to two reasons. One reason is because once the price goes up, more sellers whose cost is now lower than the price will jump in and supply more into this market and earn some producer surplus, earn some profits. And the existing sellers in this market who were selling when the price was 20 bucks now earn a higher price of $30, and then they earn higher profits and their producer surplus also goes up. Okay. All right. So that's how we analyze changes to producer surplus when there is an increase or decrease in prices. Okay, so you are able to disaggregate those effects between change in producer surplus because of increased supply and change in producer surplus because existing suppliers' profit margins improve. Okay, all right. So when we think about market efficiency, right? So when we think about market efficiency, we want to look at the total surplus that the market outcome generates. So we let the market run its course, supply meets demand, the price clears at the equilibrium price, and we want to know what is the total amount of surplus created in this market. Okay. So the total surplus in the market is the amount of surplus which is accrued to the consumers, the consumer surplus, and the amount of surplus which is generated for the producers, the producer surplus. So the total surplus in this market is going to be consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. Okay. So if you think about consumer surplus, it's measuring the value to buyers minus the amount paid by buyers, the willingness to pay for buyers that represents the value to buyers minus the price that they paid to receive this good, that represents consumer surplus. This is the buyer's gain from participating inside the market. On the other hand, Producer surplus is the amount received by sellers, the price which is paid to the sellers minus the cost to sellers. These are the sellers' profits or gains from participating in the market. So the total surplus, if I look at this, is the value to buyers minus the amount paid by buyers plus the amount received by sellers minus the cost to sellers. The amount received by sellers is the amount paid by buyers. So the total surplus is going to be the value to buyers minus the cost to sellers, right? Because these two things are the same. Amount paid by buyers is the amount received by sellers in a competitive market where there's no taxes or any other kind of distortions which wedge in the price between received by sellers and the price paid by buyers. Okay? So the total surplus in the market is the value to buyers minus the cost to sellers. Okay. Okay. So the question is the allocation that the market makes. So we're talking about a competitive market. So we have supply and demand in this competitive market. So the interaction between supply and demand basically determines what the equilibrium price will be in the market, right? So the question becomes, okay, is this allocation that the market comes up with, is that desirable, right? So in a market economy, the decision making is decentralized, right? So in a certain sense, people are buyers and sellers come into the market. They pursue their own self-interest. So sellers want to sell at the highest price they can. Buyers want to buy at the lowest price they can, and they essentially bid against each other. So they bargain with each other. There's repeated interactions between buyers and sellers. And it's not just one buyer and seller engaged in this transaction. There's millions of buyers and sellers who are engaged in this transaction, and the market price is determined by these interactions between many self-interested buyers and sellers in the market, right? And the total surplus is going to measure the society's well-being, right? So if we think about society as consisting of consumers and producers as buyers and sellers, we want to know how much welfare or how much surplus is created for consumers, which is measured by the consumer surplus, and how much welfare is created for the producers, which is measured by producer surplus. And we want to ask the question, what kind of market, what kind of economic system will generate the biggest total surplus, right? So for market allocation to be efficient, for the allocation that the market comes up, for that to be considered efficient, it needs to be an allocation where both producer surplus and consumer surplus, the sum of those two, the total surplus generated at that allocation is maximized. Right? That you can't find any alternative system where you can improve on total surplus uh, relative to what the market can allocate. Okay, so the efficient allocation means, okay, so if we think about what efficiency means, is that it should be an outcome, it should be an allocation which maximizes total surplus. Okay, so what kind of system will generate an outcome where the total surplus generated at that allocation is maximized? You can't do any better than that particular allocation. So what does it mean for efficiency? That consumers who have the highest willingness to pay should receive the good. Okay, so the goods are consumed by consumers who have the highest willingness to pay. A high willingness to pay indicates that they value this good the most. So consumers who value the good the most should actually receive the good in the economy, right, in the system. The goods that are produced should be produced by producers who are able to produce them at the lowest cost, right? Producers who have the lowest cost should be the suppliers of this good, and consumers who have the highest willingness to pay or the highest valuation should be the net recipients of this good, right? And raising or lowering the quantity of good should not increase total surplus. So that's the three conditions for when we consider an allocation to be efficient. An allocation is considered to be efficient where where consumers who value the good the most receive the good, are able to consume the good. The producers who are able to produce the good at the cheapest prices at the lowest cost are the suppliers in in that particular outcome, and you can't improve upon this situation. right? That's what it means for an allocation to be efficient. All right. So what does it mean in practice, right? So let's think about what the market equilibrium looks like and ask the question, is the allocation that the market provides efficient or not based on the criteria we've established? Okay. So let's start off with the setup for the market. Okay. So in a market, we are going to look at the interaction. We're trying to figure out the uh, interaction between prices and quantities. So we have an upward sloping supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve, the usual stuff, and the market goes into equilibrium. Okay, supply and demand interact with each other. The buyers in the market are going to interact with the sellers in the market. They interact with each other, and then they determine what the equilibrium price should be. And this is the market comes up with an equilibrium price of $30 and an equilibrium quantity of 15 units, right? So 15,000 units, let's say. Okay, that's what the market says is the efficient outcome, is the right outcome. That's the outcome, at least the market goes into equilibrium. Okay, so let's think about the total surplus. First, let's think about what the amount of consumer surplus at this price is. So the consumer surplus at this market outcome, right, at the equilibrium outcome in the market is the area of this triangle here. The area of this triangle, the area above the price, but below the demand curve from 0 to this quantity. Okay, so this area of this triangle represents consumer surplus. The area of this triangle, of the yellow triangle here, represents producer surplus. So the area below the price, but above the supply curve, going from quantity 0 to the Q, this triangle here represents producer surplus. So the total surplus is the sum of these two triangles, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So this big triangle here represents the total surplus. Okay. Right. And this is what the market allocates. Now the question becomes, is this market equilibrium actually efficient? Okay. Let's consider what our three criteria for efficiency were: consumers with the highest willingness to pay end up consuming the good, producers with the lowest cost end up producing the good, and we can't do any better than this particular outcome. This action generates the highest total surplus. Okay. All right, so let's think about which buyers consume the good. That's the first criteria. So if I think about which buyers end up consuming the good in this market, the consumers with the highest willingness to pay, so the highest willingness to pay is about $60 for a unit of this good, they receive the good, and then we essentially distribute the good based on their valuation, on their willingness to pay. So the person with the highest willingness to pay certainly receives the good. Then we go on to the next highest valuation, and so on. So every buyer whose willingness to pay is higher than the price that the market sets is going to receive the good. And these are all buyers who have very high willingness to pay, right? These are all buyers with the highest willingness to pay, and they all receive the good. They're all able to buy this good at the market price. Any buyer whose willingness to pay is lower than the market price is priced out of this market, right? So every buyer who doesn't value the good at $30 or more, they just stay out of the market. They don't receive the good. They're not able to buy, right? So in that sense, what this market outcome guarantees is that buyers with the highest willingness to pay end up receiving the good. Buyers who have lower willingness to pay essentially get priced out of the market, and they don't receive this good. Okay, so the good goes to the buyers who value it the most. So that's the check, right? So that's the first criteria satisfied for efficiency in the allocation, that the good is consumed by buyers with the highest willingness to pay. Okay, so let's turn to the sellers who produce these goods and services. So if you think about who produces the goods, every seller whose cost is less than $30 will sell the good, right? So this is the lowest cost producer in this market who has a cost of about $15. He certainly is in the market, and then seller with a cost of about marginal cost of over $16 per unit, she is able to sell. So all the low cost sellers in this market are able to sell into the market, right? So every seller whose cost is lower than the price that the market is willing to support is able to sell into this market. And for every seller whose cost is above the price that the market sets, they won't be able to sell in this market, right? So in this particular setup, it's only the sellers with the lowest cost who are able to sell or supply into this market. So the sellers with the lowest cost produce the good, and that's the second thing, right? So that's the second criteria for how we say an allocation is sufficient, is that the goods that get produced are produced by sellers who are able to get them to the market at the lowest cost, right? Right. And so we have the two criteria that we have in mind already satisfied, right? We know that uh, when the market goes into equilibrium, buyers with the highest willingness to pay are the ones who end up with the good. Sellers with the lowest cost are the ones who end up producing the good. And now we'll consider the third allocation, is that does the equilibrium quantity, does the quantity at which the market go into equilibrium actually maximize total surplus? Okay. All right, so let's consider what the total surplus is. Okay, right. So if I produce, okay, so let's just do some quick calculations here. So the total surplus in this market is going to be half times base times the height here is this, right? So the base here is 60 minus 15, so that's 45, right? So that's 45 here, and the height here is 15. Okay, and divided by 2. So this is the total surplus when the market is at equilibrium. So what happens if I choose to produce at a quantity higher or lower than this? Suppose I want to choose to produce a quantity of 20 units. Okay. So if I produce 20 units, so if the quantity here, when Q is 20, the cost of producing, the marginal cost of production here is the height of the supply curve. So the marginal cost of production here is 40 bucks or $35, right? So the marginal cost of production here is 35. The willingness to pay for this marginal unit, for the 20th unit that gets produced. So the simplest way to understand is that if I produce the 20th unit, it costs me $35 to produce the 20th unit. That's what it means for the marginal cost to be $35. It says that if I produce the 20th unit, it'll cost me $35 to produce that unit. The maximum willingness to pay for the 20th unit that was produced is only 20 bucks. Right? The value to consumers of that marginal unit, of the 20th unit that's produced, is only 20 bucks. So it costs me more to produce this 20th unit relative to what the willingness to pay for that 20th unit is, right? So this is going to decrease total surplus, because if I think about it, this is value destructive, because I end up producing the 20 unit by expending $35. Remember, $35 is representing underlying inputs that you're using to produce this good. So I spend $35 worth of resources that the society owns to produce this good, and then I'm able to only receive $20 back by selling this good, because the willingness to pay is only 20 bucks. So I'm losing $15 on every unit. I'm destroying about $15 worth of resources, society's resources, by producing at this inefficient level, right? So the only way for me to increase total surplus is by reducing this waste, because all of this is going to be waste. In a certain sense, this is what we call a dead weight loss. Okay, this is basically a straightforward loss, because in a certain sense I have a problem on my hands, because I'm producing at an inefficient level. If I produce at anything over 15 units, at every single unit, if I produce the 16th unit, the marginal cost exceeds the willingness to pay, and this is going to reduce total surplus, because I'm destroying value in a certain sense. It's costing me more to produce the good than people are willing to pay for that. Okay, and the only way I can avoid this deadweight loss is to basically pare back on the quantity. So, and slowly the total surplus is increased by reducing the quantity, by reducing Q, right? So this is true at any quantity greater than 15. So if I try to produce more, I'm going to realize these losses because the cost of production, the marginal cost of production of each additional good at Q greater than 15 is greater than the value to buyers for any marginal unit above the level of 15. Right? Similar arguments abound on the other side of this. So suppose I end up producing only 10 units. So if I have Q is set to 10, I have a mismatch. Right? When Q is 10, the marginal cost to production is about $25, right? So cost of producing is $25. The value to consumers for this marginal unit is $40, right? So that makes sense. This is a good situation to be in. I'm at 10. It costs me $25 to produce it. Consumers are willing to pay $40 for that 10th unit I produced. So there is positive surplus here. But I realize that I can increase. So if I stop here, this is the size of my deadweight loss, right? This rectangle here represents the size, the DWL as we write. This is what we call a deadweight loss, because this is basically all the surplus that I'm not capturing by producing a little bit more. Because here, when I produce the 11th unit, the marginal benefit is here, the marginal cost goes up slightly, but there's still a big gap between those two. So the 11th unit can be produced and be sold profitably. So it'll cost you I don't know, $26 to produce the 11th unit, but consumers are still willing to pay $39 for that. You should produce the 11th unit. Why aren't you producing the 11th unit? That's inefficient. That's a point of inefficient production, and that's the thing, right? So the total surplus can be increased in this case by increasing output, by increasing how much quantity there is, and slowly you increase quantity all the way back to 15 so that you can absorb all of this deadweight loss. Okay. So at any Q less than 15, it doesn't make sense to stop production at anything less than 15 units, because at any if I consider these situations, at anything less than 15, the marginal benefit to production exceeds the marginal cost to production. So I much rather produce the additional unit, right? So in a certain sense, when we talked about how we make a decision on whether an additional unit should be produced or not, it's a question of what is the marginal benefit derived from producing this additional unit, and what is the marginal cost incurred from producing this additional unit. Okay. So in a certain sense, that meets the third criterion, right? So the market outcome meets all three criteria for efficiency. On the first consideration, the market outcome means that buyers with the highest willingness to pay are the ones who end up with the good. Okay. On the second consideration, sellers with the lowest cost are the ones who end up selling the good. And on the third consideration, there is no other outcome, there is no other allocation where the total surplus is maximized. If you produce at anything less than the equilibrium quantity set by the market outcome, then you are going to have deadweight losses of one kind or the other. In this case, you're going to have deadweight loss realized from inefficient production, because the marginal benefit is much higher than the marginal cost. So you should be producing the additional units all the way up to 15. And in the previous case that we considered, we realized a deadweight loss of the other kind, where there is inefficient production, there's overproduction, right? So here the marginal cost of production exceeds the marginal benefit to production, so you shouldn't be producing this overproduction. You're overproducing in this market, so you cut back on Q and you get back into equilibrium, right? So the market outcome just in this case meets all three criteria that we've set for the efficient for an allocation to be considered efficient, and in a certain sense, that's how we make the argument that the market itself should be efficient. So if it's a perfectly competitive market with a lot of buyers and sellers in this market, then the price and quantity at which the market goes into equilibrium is an efficient allocation, not only from the individual's point of view, but also from the So from society's point of view, it not only maximizes individual welfare or surplus, it also maximizes the total surplus generated for the entirety of society. Okay. So that's the argument that Adam Smith basically propounds, right? So if you go back into the history of economic thought in general, Adam Smith, a lot of modern economics begins, at least history of economic thought as we understand it in the formal sense, begins in 1776 to a certain degree. I mean, there were economists before then, but economics was not more or less informal science up until this point. But Adam Smith comes around in 1776 and he writes in The Wealth of Nations about this notion of an invisible hand, right? So I have a couple of passages from what Adam Smith's big argument boils down to in The Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith, first of all, is reasonable in the sense that he understands that more or less people depend on each other to get the goods and services that they need, right? So the theory essentially starts from the notion of comparative advantages, right? No two people have the same ability to do the same job, right? I might be better at teaching, you might be better at coding, we have different skill sets. I'm better at one thing, you're better at a different thing. The argument goes that if we rely on each other to exploit our own comparative advantage, and then we exchange that with each other, the gains from that comparative advantage with each other, so that we are both happy in the transaction, right? It goes back to fundamentals. Trade doesn't happen. Trade between two people who are trading without any coercion doesn't happen unless both parties think that they're better off making the trade rather than not make the trade, right? In a certain sense, the person who I exchange my service for yours good only if I think that it's a fair trade. It's a trade without coercion. So we each use our comparative advantage to generate some kind of surplus, and then we exchange that with each other to um, benefit both of us. So Adam Smith recognizes that we all have a need to trade with each other to get the goods and services that we want to consume. But his argument is that we can't depend on the benevolence of our trading partner. We can't just depend on the other person acting in good faith or them being empathetic or whatever it is. You're much better off relying on their self interest, right? Because self interest, in a certain sense, is one, you can think of it as a more primal instinct, right? Self interest is basically self preservation, is innate to almost every human being. So, self preservation is a primal instinct. So, self interest, in certain sense, is just an expression of this desire for self preservation. So, if you rely on self interest, so you let people act on their own self interest in whatever way they think is they want to pursue their self interest, that and then you let them trade with each other. Each person who enters the market behaving in such a way so that they are optimizing their own self-interest. So a buyer who enters into the market is not looking to pay the highest price they want to pay. They're trying to get the cheapest bargain that they can find. They want to get the good for the lowest price possible. The seller who's entering into this market is not trying to sell at the cheapest price in the market they could. They're trying to sell at the highest price that they can possibly make to realize the biggest profit, right? So buyers are pursuing their self-interest, sellers are pursuing their self-interest, and then you let them trade amongst each other without any coercion, right? And that's the thing, right? So there's a famous passage from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations where he goes, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher or the baker or the brewer that we expect our dinner, but from their self-interest, right? The butcher, the baker, or the brewer are not producing their goods and services out of the goodness of their heart, out of some kind of benevolent, um, some instinct for benevolence. What they're trying to do is to make a buck. They're trying to make a profit, and that's how goods get produced in this economy. Right? So that's the idea. Right? So Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand is to say, let everyone, buyers and sellers, pursue their self-interest. Let them meet inside a market. Let them trade with each other. Let them bargain hard with each other. Sellers want to get the highest price, so they're going to bargain really hard. Buyers want to get the cheapest bargain, so they're going to bargain really hard. And the equilibrium price that the market sets upon, where there's millions of these people interacting with each other over trillions of transactions, the price that the market goes into equilibrium at is efficient in the sense that it allocates the goods to the people with the highest willingness to pay. The goods are produced by the sellers with the lowest cost to produce, and the allocation the market decides upon is going to maximize total surplus. Right. So this is what he talks about when he talks about the invisible hand, is that the price mechanism in the market acts in such a way in order to bring together buyers and sellers who are pursuing their self-interest and guarantees an efficient outcome, right? And in a certain sense, if you go from a single buyer and a single seller acting purely on their self-interest and realizing the greatest gain for them, greatest surplus that they can achieve on a societal level, that same self-interest, the same motivation for the self-interest is going to get us to the market outcome, which also maximizes social welfare, right? So that's the story with Adam Smith's invisible hand. It's a very powerful notion. It's the instinct for arguments on the right in general for markets to be left unfettered, for the market mechanism to just take its own course, because it's a very compelling argument in theory. In theory, when there are millions of buyers and sellers who are all operating from the same basis of information and who are all operating under no threat of coercion, then they are going to bargain with each other and get to the efficient allocation, right? From not only from the individual's point of view, but from a society's point of view. But that might not always be the case, and that's where we'll go next. Okay, so when we think about market efficiency, the notion is owed to Adam Smith's invisible hand story. So if you think about what the market is doing, the market is a mechanism for bringing in buyers and sellers together. Buyers have their own private valuations and the information they possess. Sellers have their own private signals and the information that they have. And now they start trading, and the price mechanism guides everyone, guides the market to the efficient outcome, right? And that generates economic efficiency. So there's no economic efficiencies in the sense that there's no deadweight losses realized at the market outcome, right? So that leads us to arguing that maybe free markets are the best way to organize economic activity. And in a certain sense, it's a very compelling argument based on, if you buy this story that I've been telling you about the invisible hand and the price mechanism and how the market outcome is efficient, then this is a fairly compelling narrative, right? So this story doesn't stop there. So forces and supply and demand. So let's step through it. So the forces of supply and demand, the interaction between buyers and sellers, leads to resources being allocated efficiently. What we mean by efficient resource allocation is where buyers with the highest willingness to pay receive the good, sellers with the lowest cost produce the good. That's what we mean as the efficient allocation of resources. Society has scarce resources, you want to use them efficiently, and so you want to give, especially on the sell side, where you want the producers who are able to produce this good and service at the lowest cost to be able to sell this good. Okay. What the assumptions that make this outcome possible is the assumptions that we make about how markets generally function. That we assume that markets are perfectly competitive, right? Markets are said to be perfectly competitive. We talked about this when no one has pricing power. So there's millions of buyers and billions of sellers. So they interact with each other inside the market, but no individual interaction can affect the market price directly. It's only the accumulation of these millions of transactions all taken together which moves the market price, right? So individual buyers and sellers don't have any pricing power. They all act as if they are price takers, and that's what we mean as a perfectly competitive market. Okay, but the market equilibrium is efficient only when this assumption holds true. Only if we assume that markets are perfectly competitive is the outcome generated by the market efficient. And that therein lies the rub, right? Some markets are more competitive than others. We don't really get to see a market which is completely free more often than not, but we can see more or less free competitive markets in different sectors, right? So if this assumption about markets being perfectly competitive is challenged in a significant way, then we have a problem. Then the allocation that the market comes to is not going to be the efficient allocation, and that's what we talk about when we say market failure. Yeah. So market failure, we'll talk about two different um, cases of market failure. Actually, there's three. We'll get to all three of them. First case is where there is market power. Okay, market power is a situation where a single buyer or a single seller has the ability by their actions to affect the market price, right? The classic case of this is a monopoly, right? A monopoly is where a single seller in the market is so large that their actions are able to move the market price, right? If you are the only game in town, you can set the price as high as you want. If you're a seller, you are the only good, you're the only person who's able to sell this good, and there is some protections that allow you to sell, be the only player in this game who's selling this good. Everyone has to come to you to buy this good, and you have enormous pricing power. You can price the good as much as you want, right? So if you want to imagine where monopoly is operationalized, it's around, let's say, pharmaceutical drugs which are issued patents, right? So a drug company goes through a very laborious process to develop a good. They file a patent on this drug, and then the government gives them the ability to be the sole distributor and producer of this good for a set period of time. For 20 years, as long as you hold the patent on that particular drug, no one else can sell that drug. This is a government sanctioned monopoly because you are the only game in town, you're the only person with this drug, and if it's a life saving drug, lots of people want to buy this drug from you, and you can set prices as high as you possibly want. And that might not be a good thing from society's point of view, right? So that's one case. And then monopsony is the other case. Monopsony is where one single buyer can dominate the entire market. So that can put a lot of downward pressure on prices in the market. So we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about market failures and around monopolies and monopsonies. Okay. The second thing that we'll pick up in the next session is to talk about externalities. Okay. Externalities are when the private actions of one particular individual impose costs not only on that particular individual but also society as a whole, right? So classic example which is given for externalities is around pollution, right? I'm a firm, I'm producing my good, and I want to produce it at the cheapest price. That's my incentive. That's the incentive that the market gives me, is to produce the good at the cheapest price as possible. Okay, so I use the cheapest materials available. I source the cheapest labor available. I try to be as efficient as possible, but maybe it ends up, I end up polluting a lot into, I end up emitting a lot of pollution into the air because so if I want to reduce the amount of pollution emissions, it'll cost me more to do that. Unless I'm compelled to do that, I don't want to do that because my incentive is to keep my cost as low as possible, the cost of production to be as low as possible. So I don't care, right? My private incentive as a producer is not to do pollution abatement without coercion, without somebody directing me to do it and imposing costs on me to do it. So this is a case where the benefit is accruing to the firm which is doing all the pollution, but the cost of all of this pollution is borne by society as a large. You're imposing a disproportionate cost on the rest of society in while you're trying to pursue your own self-interest. And the market can't correct this behavior. The market is going to incentivize that firm to do this as long as they can. So when there are externalities, then the market outcome is not efficient anymore, and there is a role for government to step in and regulate and this kind of behavior. Okay, and the third thing is around inefficient equilibrium, right? This is what we call in general, that's where we're going next, is around the provisioning of what we call public goods, right? Public goods are goods where society as a whole wants to use these goods. Think about the park in your neighborhood, or a dam, or a highway, or any large infrastructure project where millions of people are going to use this good. The market is not going to provide an adequate amount of it, right? Like public spaces in general, they are public spaces in the sense that, okay, so suppose I put up a park in my neighborhood. Now it costs me to to put up this park, to zone this land off, to plant these, put in a playground, plant these trees, make sure it's maintained. I have all of these costs uh, which I'm bearing, right? But imagine there's two situations. If I let private industry produce this good, what they're going to do is to gate this entire park off, charge exorbitant fees for people to get into this park, to access this park, and that's the only way these spaces can be produced. And they might not even be produced all that much, because maybe it's a good where, if it's clean air, people might just not go to the park. They might just go somewhere else, just walk around. Why are you going to pay a fee to get into this park? So you might get some goods and services which are very desirable from a social point of view, but the market might provide under there might be under provisioning or inefficient production of some kinds of these goods. So that's what we'll do in the next session, where we'll talk about public goods, why public goods are under provision, and why there's a role for government to step in and produce these goods and services. Okay. All right. So there's a quick summary here that you can take a look at, and I'll stop this session here. So if there's any questions on any of the material that we've done today around producer surplus, around the invisible hand story, around market inefficiencies, just leave them in the comments below the video so I can address them as you go along, or office hours. So come see me in office hours, and I'm happy to help there as well. All right. Okay. I hope everyone is doing well, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and good luck.